Shocking investigators uncovered archives revealing a hidden pattern in historical mysteries that defied science itself. Scientists reported disturbing anomalies buried beneath centuries of silence, each clue exposing an unsettling truth about human history slowly emerging from classified findings until now. The road through Perleberg was quiet that November evening in 1809. Damp air drifted through the narrow streets, carrying the smell of rain-soaked earth and wood smoke from distant chimneys. Horses shifted restlessly beside a small inn as travelers spoke in hushed voices under fading lantern light. Europe was deep in the shadow of the Napoleonic Wars, where borders shifted like smoke and suspicion lingered in every crowded tavern. In a world shaped by spies, secret negotiations, and political betrayal, one man stepped briefly out of sight and was never seen again. Benjamin Bathurst was not an ordinary traveler. A British diplomat and envoy, Bathurst had been entrusted with sensitive assignments during one of the most unstable periods in European history. Returning from Vienna after a failed attempt to support resistance against Napoleon, he journeyed north through German territory under increasing anxiety. Reports suggest he believed French agents were following him. Whether this fear was justified or born from exhaustion remains uncertain. On the evening of November 25th, Bathurst and his companion, Benjamin Crawford, stopped at an inn in Perleberg, then part of Prussia. Witnesses later recalled Bathurst appearing tense but composed. He ate supper, inspected the horses, and prepared for departure. Then, according to the accounts that survive, he walked around the front of the carriage and vanished. There was no cry for help, no struggle, no clear sign of violence. One moment he was there beneath the dim glow of lanterns, and the next he was gone into the darkness. Searches began almost immediately. Local residents combed the streets and nearby fields. Authorities questioned innkeepers, servants, and travelers. Days later, some of Bathurst's belongings were discovered. A fur coat, reportedly hidden in a nearby building, and later, a pair of trousers found in the woods. Yet the man himself had disappeared without trace. The most widely accepted explanation is perhaps the simplest. Historians have long suspected Bathurst was murdered, possibly by thieves who saw him as a wealthy foreign traveler during chaotic wartime conditions. The roads of early 19th century Europe were dangerous places, especially after nightfall. A robbery gone wrong could explain the suddenness of his disappearance and the scattered belongings later recovered. Others believe political motives may have been involved. Bathurst's diplomatic role placed him close to sensitive military affairs. At the height of Napoleon's power, espionage networks stretched across the continent. Could French operatives have intercepted him quietly, eliminating a political threat before disappearing into the confusion of war? Some historians point to reports that Bathurst had become increasingly paranoid during his journey, convinced he was being hunted. Was this fear irrational, or evidence that he knew more than he revealed? And then there are the stranger theories. Over the decades, Bathurst's disappearance has entered the realm of historical folklore. Some writers have suggested he slipped somehow into another place entirely, a sudden tear in reality, a doorway unseen in the fog of that Prussian street. Others speak of supernatural intervention, citing the eerie stillness surrounding the event and the absence of reliable evidence. While such theories remain unsupported by historical proof, they continue to fascinate because of one stubborn fact. Nobody can fully explain how a prominent diplomat vanished so completely in the middle of a populated town. Even the later discovery of human remains decades afterward failed to settle the mystery conclusively. Some believed the bones belonged to Bathurst. Others dismissed the claim due to inconsistent evidence and poor forensic methods of the era. The uncertainty only deepened the legend. Today, Perleberg appears peaceful, its quiet streets far removed from the turmoil of Napoleonic Europe. Yet somewhere within the records, witness statements, and fading memories of that cold November night, lies a gap that history has never managed to close. Did Benjamin Bathurst fall victim to ordinary violence hidden by time, or did something far stranger occur beneath those dim carriage lamps? More than 2 centuries later, the silence surrounding his disappearance remains as unsettling as ever. If the disappearance of Benjamin Bathurst revealed how a single person could vanish into uncertainty, the next mystery would challenge something even larger: the sky itself. Decades after Bathurst stepped into darkness and seemingly out of history, thousands of ordinary people across the United States began reporting something they could not explain: silent craft drifting through the night long before modern aviation should have made such machines possible. It often began at dusk. Across the empty plains of Kansas, above the orchards of California, and over the growing industrial cities of the American Midwest, witnesses described strange cigar-shaped objects moving slowly through the clouds. Some carried bright searchlights that swept across fields and rooftops below. Others appeared metallic, mechanical, almost impossibly advanced for the closing years of the 19th century. Farmers, judges, newspaper editors, railway workers, and entire groups of townspeople claimed to have seen them. The year was 1896. At that time, human flight remained largely experimental. The Wright brothers would not achieve their famous flight for several more years. Balloons existed, of course, but these reported machines appeared different. Witnesses spoke of structured vessels guided with apparent control, sometimes moving against the wind. Many accounts described propellers, wings, engines, and even human-like occupants speaking from the craft itself. One of the earliest major sightings occurred in California. Newspapers reported mysterious lights traveling across the evening sky near Sacramento and Oakland. Within weeks, sightings spread eastward across the country almost like a moving wave. Reports flooded local papers from Nebraska, Missouri, Texas, Illinois, and beyond. In an era before radio communication connected the nation instantly, the consistency of certain descriptions puzzled many observers. Were these sightings elaborate hoaxes fueled by sensational journalism? Or had people truly witnessed something extraordinary? Historians point out that the late 1800s were filled with technological optimism. Electricity was transforming cities. Inventors became public celebrities. It was an age fascinated by mechanical progress, where the impossible often became reality within a generation. Some researchers believe the phantom airship craze reflected public imagination projecting itself into the skies. Newspapers competing for readership may have exaggerated or even invented stories to captivate audiences hungry for wonder. Yet not all accounts are easily dismissed. Certain witnesses appeared credible and reluctant to speak publicly. In several cases, entire communities claimed to observe the same object simultaneously. One report from Texas described a large airborne craft passing low over farmland while emitting strange mechanical sounds. Another account from Illinois told of a glowing vessel hovering silently above a rural road before disappearing into clouds without explanation. Then there are the more unusual details. Some stories claimed the airships carried mysterious inventors testing secret technology in isolation from the public. According to these theories, brilliant engineers may have achieved powered flight years before official history recognizes it, only for their experiments to vanish into obscurity. The names of supposed inventors surfaced occasionally in newspapers, though none were conclusively linked to functioning aircraft. Others looked beyond conventional explanations entirely. As the decades passed and modern UFO discussions emerged in the 20th century, the phantom airships were re-examined through a different lens. Some researchers noted striking similarities between the 1890s sightings and later reports of unidentified flying objects: glowing lights, silent movement, sudden disappearances, and unexplained aerial behavior. Could the airships represent an earlier manifestation of the same phenomenon, later generations would interpret differently? Or were witnesses simply describing unfamiliar sights using the technological language available to them at the time? There are even stranger possibilities suggested quietly on the edges of historical discussion. Some theorists have wondered whether the sightings reflected temporary distortions in perception, collective psychological phenomena, or encounters with technologies not yet understood. A few accounts became deeply bizarre, involving alleged conversations with occupants who spoke cryptically about distant places and unknown energy sources. As the phantom lights of the 1890s fade into the wider uncertainty of modern memory, the narrative shifts from open skies to enclosed rooms, where mysteries no longer drift above towns, but settle quietly within walls that remember everything and reveal almost nothing. In late Victorian London, along a quiet stretch in Balham, stood a respectable suburban home known as the Grove. From the outside, it reflected the order and discipline of its era: brickwork, gaslight, and the restrained elegance of a growing city confident in its progress. But inside, in the autumn of 1876, something far less orderly was unfolding. A case would emerge that would confound investigators, divide public opinion, and leave behind questions that still resist definitive answers. Charles Bravo, a young and well-regarded barrister, had recently moved into the Grove with his wife, Florence Bravo. Their marriage, from the beginning, was marked by tension, rumors of strain, emotional distance, and disagreements that remained largely hidden behind the polished surface of Victorian respectability. On the evening of April 18th, Bravo became violently ill after drinking a small amount of what was later believed to be poisoned water or wine. Over the next 4 days, his condition worsened in a manner that alarmed attending physicians. The symptoms were severe, consistent with poisoning, yet difficult to conclusively categorize with the medical knowledge of the time. The substance most frequently identified in later analysis was antimony, a compound capable of producing symptoms strikingly similar to arsenic poisoning. But unlike many clearer cases of Victorian-era toxicology, this one resisted easy interpretation. Was the dose administered intentionally? Was it accidental? Or was something more complex unfolding within the private dynamics of the household? As Bravo's condition deteriorated, the atmosphere inside the Grove grew increasingly tense. Doctors, servants, and visitors moved through the house, each carrying fragments of observation that would later become pieces of an incomplete puzzle. Florence Bravo remained by his side, yet her behavior, described in varying accounts as composed, distressed, or strangely detached, became a focal point of later suspicion. At the same time, other individuals connected to the household also came under scrutiny, including household staff and acquaintances whose movements and testimonies never aligned perfectly. When Charles Bravo died on April 21st, the medical verdict of poisoning was clear. What remained unclear was the source. Victorian London, already accustomed to scandal and intrigue, found itself absorbed by the case. Newspapers dissected every detail, and public fascination quickly hardened into competing narratives. Some believed Florence had administered the poison, motivated by personal grievances or a desire to escape an unhappy marriage. Others suggested a tragic accident, perhaps a mistaken dose of medication or an unintended consequence of treatment. A smaller but persistent set of theories pointed toward suicide, proposing that Bravo himself may have ingested the substance deliberately, though the evidence for this remains ambiguous and contested. Then there are the quieter, less easily categorized possibilities that continue to surface in historical discussion. Could another member of the household have been responsible, acting out of loyalty, resentment, or secrecy? Was there an external influence, someone briefly present in the domestic space whose role was never fully recorded? The structure of Victorian households, with their layered hierarchies of servants and private visitors, leaves room for gaps where certainty should exist. The inquest that followed became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings of its time, yet it ended without a definitive resolution. Jurors struggled to reconcile medical testimony, character assessments, and conflicting witness statements. The result was an open verdict, an official acknowledgement that the cause of death was poisoning, but without a confirmed perpetrator or motive. Over time, the case of Charles Bravo settled into history not as a solved crime, but as a lingering question embedded in the fabric of Victorian London. The Grove itself stands as a quiet reminder of how domestic spaces can conceal complexity beneath ordinary surfaces. Every corridor, every room, once filled with testimony and speculation, now holds only silence. And so the question remains, suspended like a faint echo from another century. In a house full of witnesses, motives, and medicine, how does truth become so difficult to grasp? And what, if anything, was left unspoken in those final days at the Grove? Far beyond the reach of crowded ports and familiar trade routes, the Arctic Ocean in the mid-19th century remained one of the least understood frontiers on Earth. Vast fields of drifting ice shifted like a living terrain, swallowing ships whole and rewriting maps with every passing season. It was here, in this realm of cold horizons and endless white, that the story of the merchant vessel known as the Jenny began its final and most unsettling chapter. According to maritime records preserved from the period, the Jenny was a small trading and exploration vessel that set out into Arctic waters during a time when polar navigation still relied heavily on experience, intuition, and fragile equipment. The ship's purpose, like many of its kind, was tied to trade and seasonal routes, paths that demanded precision, timing, and a constant negotiation with ice that could close in without warning. At some point during its voyage, the Jenny became trapped in pack ice. This alone was not unusual. Many ships of the era met similar fates, frozen in place for months, sometimes years, waiting for thawing conditions or rescue. What makes the account of the Jenny so persistent in historical memory is not simply that it was trapped, but what was reportedly found when it was later encountered. Several accounts describe a whaling vessel discovering the Jenny drifting silently among the ice. Its sails were reportedly still partially rigged, its hull intact but locked within frozen waters. There were no visible signs of struggle on deck, no immediate indication of struggle or abandonment. And yet, when explorers boarded the ship, they found something deeply unsettling. The crew was gone. In some versions of the account, the ship's logbook remained open, its final entries describing increasing cold, dwindling provisions, and the growing impossibility of escape. The handwriting, if the reports are accurate, suggested a gradual descent into isolation rather than a sudden catastrophe. The last entry is often said to end abruptly, as though interrupted mid-thought. But it is the absence that defines the mystery. No lifeboats were conclusively accounted for. No definitive evidence explained how or why an entire crew would leave a still intact vessel in such extreme conditions. In the Arctic, survival outside a ship would have been extraordinarily unlikely without immediate rescue or nearby landfall. Mainstream explanations tend to remain cautious. Some historians suggest that shifting ice may have damaged the vessel in ways not immediately visible, forcing an evacuation that ended tragically on the surrounding frozen sea. Others propose that fire, structural failure, or carbon monoxide accumulation could have compelled the crew to abandon ship in panic. In such conditions, even small misjudgments could become irreversible. Yet gaps in the narrative have allowed alternative interpretations to take shape over time. Could the crew have misjudged their position and attempted a desperate journey across ice that broke apart beneath them? Could sudden weather changes have erased any trace of their path within hours? Some maritime theorists point to the Arctic's capacity to preserve and conceal simultaneously, freezing evidence in place while burying it beneath shifting layers of ice and snow. There are also more speculative reflections that occasionally surface in discussions of polar disappearances. The idea that extreme environments can distort perception, create isolation-induced disorientation, or even trigger collective decision-making under pressure has been considered in psychological studies of long expeditions. In such interpretations, the crew's disappearance becomes not a single event, but a sequence of human responses to an environment that leaves little room for error. Still, no single explanation has ever fully accounted for all the fragments attributed to the Jenny's final days. The ship itself, whether as documented or as remembered through retellings, stands as a frozen moment in maritime history, suspended between survival and silence. Today, the Arctic remains a place where history does not easily surrender its secrets. Ice shifts, melts, and reforms, carrying with it whatever once disappeared beneath its surface. And so the question lingers across time and temperature. When a ship is found intact but emptied of life in the most inhospitable waters on Earth, did the sea take its crew, or did something else unfold in the silence between ice and horizon? New York City in the early 20th century was a place of constant motion. Horse-drawn carriages still shared the streets with early automobiles, and the elevated trains thundered above avenues already crowded with ambition, commerce, and anonymity. Among its wealthier districts, Fifth Avenue stood as a symbol of refinement and stability. Storefronts filled with books, confectionaries, and imported goods, where the city's elite carried out the quiet rituals of daily life. It was here, on a winter afternoon in 1910, that Dorothy Arnold was last seen. Dorothy was the daughter of a prominent and affluent family, known within New York society and connected to the world of high-end fragrance and trade. She was young, educated, and regarded as someone with a secure place in the social structure of her time. On the surface, her life appeared carefully arranged, structured by expectation, routine, and the unspoken boundaries of her class. On December 12th, she left her family home with a simple intention: to shop for a dress. Witnesses later placed her on Fifth Avenue, moving between bookstores and department stores. One account suggests she purchased a book. Another places her in conversation with a shop assistant. Then, as the afternoon faded into evening, the trail becomes increasingly uncertain. She never returned home. At first, her absence was not treated as an emergency. In that era, it was not unusual for young women of her standing to extend outings without notice. But as hours passed, then days, the growing concern transformed into alarm. Search efforts began quickly, involving family members, private investigators, and eventually law enforcement. Yet New York City, vast and densely populated even then, offered few reliable answers. No confirmed sightings followed. No definitive evidence surfaced to explain her movements after that afternoon. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the city itself, absorbed by its crowds, its noise, its endless corridors of motion. Mainstream explanations have long attempted to frame her disappearance within familiar categories. Some investigators suggested she may have chosen to leave voluntarily, possibly seeking independence from social expectations or personal pressures that were never fully understood. Others proposed a tragic accident, an unnoticed fall, a sudden illness, or an encounter that ended in misfortune within a city too large to monitor every corner. There were also darker theories circulating in the early press. Rumors of abduction spread quickly in the absence of facts, including fears of criminal networks operating within urban centers. These claims, while widely reported at the time, remain unsupported by verifiable evidence, yet they reflect the anxieties of a rapidly modernizing city struggling to comprehend the vulnerability hidden within its own density. Another line of speculation considers psychological factors. Could Dorothy Arnold have experienced a private crisis? An emotional break that led her to intentionally sever ties with her known life? If so, the question becomes not where she went, but how someone so visible could vanish without leaving a trace in a city saturated with witnesses, records, and routines. Yet even these interpretations leave gaps. No confirmed financial withdrawals, no reliable correspondence, no physical evidence that conclusively places her beyond that final afternoon on Fifth Avenue. Each possibility accounts for part of the story, but none fully contain it. Over time, the disappearance of Dorothy Arnold settled into the broader fabric of unsolved American mysteries, a case studied, debated, and re-examined, yet never resolved. Her name appears in archives and historical discussions not as a closed chapter, but as an unresolved question embedded within the early narrative of modern urban life. And so the image remains. A young woman walking through a bustling New York street, surrounded by movement, commerce, and life at every turn. And then, without warning, no clear record of where she went next. In a city that seemed to document everything, how does a single person vanish so completely? And what does it say about the spaces between what is seen and what is never recorded? In the small coastal town of Amherst, Nova Scotia, late 19th century life moved at a slower, more restrained rhythm. Wooden houses lined quiet streets, facing cold Atlantic winds that carried the scent of salt and pine. Among them stood the Parsons family home, an unremarkable residence by all outward appearances, shaped by the modest architecture of rural Canada and the routines of everyday domestic life. But, in the winter of 1878, something began to disturb that sense of normality. The case known as the Great Amherst Mystery centers on the experiences of a young girl, referred to in historical accounts as Esther Cox. According to contemporary reports, Esther began to exhibit unexplained phenomena following a traumatic incident involving a local acquaintance. What followed would draw widespread attention from neighbors, investigators, and eventually curious observers from beyond the town itself. At first, the disturbances were subtle. Objects were said to move without contact. Knocks echoed through empty rooms. Household items appeared to shift position overnight. In a small community where superstition and practicality often coexisted, such events were initially met with skepticism. But as the occurrences reportedly increased in frequency and intensity, the boundary between doubt and concern began to blur. Witnesses described beds shaking violently, unexplained fires igniting within the home, and objects allegedly thrown across rooms without visible cause. In some accounts, even written messages appeared on surfaces, seemingly without human intervention. These reports were documented by several observers of the time, including local figures who attempted to verify or debunk what they were seeing. As word spread, the house in Amherst became a focal point of curiosity. Visitors arrived hoping to witness the phenomena firsthand. Among them were individuals who sought rational explanations, hidden mechanisms, psychological distress, or deliberate deception. Others arrived with a more open mindset, willing to consider possibilities that lay outside conventional understanding. Mainstream interpretations have generally approached the case with caution. Some historians suggest the events may be explained through a combination of adolescent psychological stress, environmental factors, and the influence of heightened attention from observers. The presence of investigators and visitors may have intensified behaviors or shaped perceptions of what was occurring inside the home. Yet the records also contain inconsistencies that continue to invite discussion. Descriptions of events vary between witnesses, and certain phenomena, if taken at face value, defy easy mechanical explanation. This has led some researchers to categorize the Amherst case within the broader study of historical poltergeist reports, where physical effects are described but rarely reproducible under controlled conditions. Within that framework, alternative interpretations emerge. Some propose that the events may reflect unconscious psychological expressions, where internal tension manifests outwardly in ways not fully understood by contemporary science. Others suggest environmental influences that could have affected perception or behavior in subtle but cumulative ways. And then there are the more speculative reflections that linger at the edges of the narrative. Could the Amherst disturbances represent a rare convergence of psychological, environmental, and social pressures that created conditions for unexplained phenomena? Or are the surviving accounts incomplete fragments of a story shaped by memory, interpretation, and the limitations of observation in the 19th century? What makes the Great Amherst Mystery particularly enduring is not only the reported phenomena, but the way it challenges the boundary between observation and interpretation. Every account depends on the eyes and expectations of those who witnessed it, and in a confined domestic space, where fear, curiosity, and belief can intertwine, certainty becomes difficult to maintain. Today, the Parsons house no longer stands as it once did, but the story remains preserved in archives, journals, and retellings that continue to circulate more than a century later. Each retelling preserves the same central tension. Something was reported to have happened there, something seen, felt, or heard, but what it ultimately was remains unresolved. And so the question persists, quiet and unsettled, like footsteps in an empty room. When a place appears ordinary in every respect, what does it mean when those who live within it insist that something extraordinary was moving just beyond the limits of explanation? From the quiet disturbances of a rural Canadian home, the narrative now shifts once again, this time away from enclosed interiors and into the dense, untamed edges of the American wilderness, where fear has always had more room to grow, and where rumor can travel faster than certainty. In the late 19th century, the expanding frontier regions of Texas and the surrounding territories were still only partially settled, their landscapes marked by vast stretches of scrubland, river valleys, and isolated homesteads. Communication was limited, law enforcement sparse, and communities often relied on shared accounts of danger to make sense of the unknown. It was in this environment, in the year 1886, that reports began to circulate of something unsettling moving through the rural edges of settlement, an encounter that would later be referred to in folklore as the devil monkey panic. The earliest descriptions are fragmentary, preserved through local accounts and later newspaper retellings. Farmers and ranchers spoke of a creature unlike anything they had seen before. It was described as upright in posture, yet not fully human in movement. Some witnesses claimed it moved with unusual speed across open ground, while others insisted it could climb or leap in ways that defied familiar animal behavior. Its appearance varied between accounts, but recurring descriptions included a dark coat of hair, elongated limbs, and an unsettling, almost deliberate awareness in its behavior. In isolated homesteads, where nightfall brought deep silence and minimal protection, reports of sightings carried immediate weight. Livestock disturbances were attributed to the presence of this unknown creature. Dogs were said to refuse approaching certain areas. In some accounts, frightened residents reported glimpsing it near barns or tree lines before it vanished into the darkness without clear trace. Mainstream historical interpretation tends to approach these reports with caution. Many researchers suggest that the devil monkey may have originated from misidentifications of known wildlife under poor lighting conditions, perhaps large primates escaping from traveling exhibitions, or more likely, exaggerated accounts of nocturnal animals such as baboons, macaques, or even bears seen at a distance. The rural environment, combined with fear and limited visibility, could easily transform ordinary encounters into extraordinary interpretations. There is also the possibility that the panic was amplified through storytelling. In small communities where news traveled by word of mouth and newspapers often favored sensational accounts, a single unusual encounter could evolve rapidly into a regional legend. Each retelling adds detail. Each listener shapes the image further, until the original observation becomes difficult to reconstruct. Yet some aspects of the reports resist simple dismissal. Witnesses from different locations and backgrounds described similar physical traits and behaviors without direct communication between them. the consistency of certain details, particularly the upright posture and rapid, agile movement, has led some folklorists and cryptozoological researchers to suggest that the phenomenon may represent either a misunderstood species or a collective cultural expression of frontier anxiety. More speculative interpretations extend further into uncertainty. Could the devil monkey accounts represent fleeting encounters with an undocumented animal species that failed to survive or integrate into known ecological records? Or do they reflect a psychological pattern common to frontier environments, where isolation and survival pressures shape perception in subtle but powerful ways? There is also the possibility that the stories were never meant to describe a single, literal creature at all. Some historians propose that the devil monkey legend may have functioned as a narrative tool, an embodiment of fear, uncertainty, and the unpredictable nature of life on the edge of settlement. In this reading, the creature becomes less a biological mystery and more a symbolic one, shaped by the anxieties of an expanding and often dangerous frontier. And yet, even with these interpretations, something remains unresolved in the surviving accounts. The descriptions are too persistent, too geographically widespread, and too emotionally consistent to disappear entirely into the category of pure invention for everyone who encountered them. Today, the devil monkey exists primarily within archives of folklore and regional memory, a figure suspended between animal, myth, and misinterpretation. It occupies a space where documentation fades and imagination begins to take hold, yet never fully replaces the uncertainty at its core. From the scattered reports of the so-called devil monkey in the American frontier, the narrative now drifts across the Atlantic, toward a landscape where legend and geography have long been intertwined. Here, in the towering silence of the Pyrenees mountains, the boundary between inhabited valleys and untamed wilderness has always felt thin, as though something ancient might still move just beyond the reach of human settlement. Stretching between modern-day France and Spain, the Pyrenees are a region of steep cliffs, dense forests, and isolated high-altitude paths carved by centuries of shepherds and traders. Villages cling to the slopes, separated by terrain that can become impassable within hours when weather shifts without warning. It is a place where stories endure, passed down through generations not only as entertainment, but as explanations for what lies beyond the limits of daily life. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, scattered accounts began to emerge from this region describing an unidentified figure moving through remote areas of the mountains. Locals referred to it in varying terms, but one recurring description stood out in travel records and folklore collections. A wild man, seen at the edge of forests or high alpine meadows, moving with a strange combination of human familiarity and animal unpredictability. Descriptions were inconsistent in detail, but striking in their shared themes. Witnesses spoke of a tall, heavily built figure, covered in hair or wearing what appeared to be natural concealment. Some accounts described upright walking, others a more hunched posture adapted to rough terrain. There were reports of footprints found in snow that did not clearly match known wildlife of the region. In several cases, shepherds claimed to have glimpsed the figure observing flocks from a distance before retreating into dense woodland. Mainstream explanations often place these reports within the broader context of misidentification and folklore. The Pyrenees are home to bears, wolves, and other large animals that, when seen briefly or under poor visibility, can be easily misinterpreted. The psychological effects of isolation in high mountain environments may also play a role, where limited human contact and natural acoustics can distort perception. Over time, such experiences can merge with regional myths of forest spirits, hermits, or wild men preserved in medieval storytelling traditions. Indeed, historical references to wild, human-like figures in European mountain regions extend far back into the Middle Ages. Manuscripts and oral traditions from the Pyrenees and surrounding areas often describe hermitic individuals who withdrew from society, surviving in remote caves or forested valleys. In some cases, these individuals were later discovered and reintegrated into villages, reinforcing the idea that wildness could sometimes be a matter of circumstance rather than biology. Yet the more unusual accounts resist simple classification. Some 19th century travelers recorded encounters that seemed too deliberate to attribute entirely to animals. They described moments of sustained observation, instances where the figure reportedly watched from a distance without fleeing immediately, as though assessing the presence of the observer. In a few cases, items were said to be displaced near shepherd shelters, suggesting either human interference or highly unusual animal behavior. These inconsistencies have led some researchers to explore more speculative interpretations. Could the wild man reports represent isolated individuals surviving outside conventional society for extended periods, gradually adapting to the environment in ways that altered their appearance and behavior? Or might they reflect a convergence of myth and reality, where existing folklore shaped the interpretation of ambiguous encounters in the mountains? There are also broader anthropological considerations. Mountain regions like the Pyrenees often preserve cultural memory in ways that flatten distinctions between history and legend. A single unfamiliar sighting can accumulate layers of interpretation over decades, transforming into a narrative figure that carries symbolic meaning as much as observational detail. And yet, even with careful analysis, a residue of uncertainty remains in the recorded accounts. Not because the evidence points clearly toward a single explanation, but because the evidence itself is fragmented, filtered through memory, storytelling, and the limitations of observation in remote terrain. Today, the wild man of the Pyrenees exists primarily at the intersection of folklore and historical curiosity. Whether rooted in misidentified wildlife, isolated human presence, or the gradual evolution of regional myth, the figure continues to appear in collected accounts as something not entirely resolved. From the shadowed valleys of the Pyrenees, where the line between myth and memory grows thin, the narrative now moves once again toward the far edges of human endurance, into a landscape where silence is not merely absence of sound, but a physical presence shaped by ice, wind, and endless night. Far above the Arctic Circle, on the northern coast of Ellesmere Island, stands the remnants of Fort Conger. Built during the late 19th century as part of ambitious Arctic exploration efforts, it was never meant to be a place of permanence. It was a foothold, temporary, fragile, and dependent on conditions that could shift without warning. Wooden structures were erected against a backdrop of frozen sea and rocky tundra, where temperatures could remain deadly for months at a time, and daylight itself became a seasonal visitor. It was from this isolated outpost that one of the Arctic's most enduring mysteries would emerge: the disappearance of a small patrol sent into the surrounding wilderness, never to return. Historical records from the period describe expedition teams operating under extreme conditions, often cut off from resupply and communication for long stretches of time. Fort Conger itself served as a base for scientific observation and survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. When a patrol was dispatched from the station, tasked with travel across the surrounding ice and terrain, the expectation was always that danger was part of the mission. But disappearance without trace remained another matter entirely. The exact details of the lost patrol vary depending on the account. Some versions describe a small group traveling to survey conditions or establish contact with distant parties. Others suggest a supply or reconnaissance mission, undertaken during a period when Arctic exploration was still defined by uncertainty and limited navigational precision. What remains consistent across reports is the outcome. The patrol departed into the frozen landscape and was never seen again. In the immediate aftermath, search efforts were constrained by the very environment that had consumed them. Ice conditions shifted rapidly, creating barriers that made movement difficult even for experienced Arctic travelers. The vastness of the terrain offered few visual landmarks, and any trace of the missing group, footprints, equipment, or signals, could easily be erased by wind or snowfall within hours. Mainstream explanations for such disappearances in Arctic expeditions often point toward environmental extremes. Sudden storms, hidden crevasses, and the unpredictable behavior of sea ice have claimed many lives during polar exploration. In such conditions, a small patrol could become disoriented, separated, or overwhelmed without leaving a recoverable record. Hypothermia and exhaustion would follow quickly, and the landscape itself would conceal the evidence almost immediately. Yet the story of the Fort Conger patrol persists not only because of its likely dangers, but because of the absence of closure. No definitive wreckage, no confirmed remains, and no clear final communication have fully accounted for what happened in those final movements beyond the station. This lack of resolution has allowed alternative interpretations to emerge over time. Some researchers have considered the possibility of navigational error compounded by extreme weather conditions, where even experienced explorers could lose all sense of direction in a uniform white landscape. Others have suggested that the patrol may have encountered previously undocumented environmental hazards, ice formations, shifting terrain, or weather phenomena capable of disorienting even well-equipped parties. More speculative reflections occasionally enter discussions of Arctic disappearances more broadly. The idea that vast polar regions may conceal remains for centuries, only revealing fragments as ice shifts and recedes, has led some to wonder whether the patrol's fate is still physically preserved somewhere beyond current reach, frozen in time, but not yet recovered. There are also psychological interpretations considered by expedition historians. Extended exposure to isolation, darkness, and cold can alter perception, decision-making, and group dynamics in subtle but profound ways. In environments where survival depends on constant judgment under stress, even minor miscalculations can cascade into irreversible outcomes. And yet, even with these frameworks, the Fort Conger patrol remains incomplete as a narrative. It exists in historical records not as a concluded event, but as an absence, an entry marked by departure followed by silence. From the frozen silence surrounding Fort Conger, where vanished patrols became part of the Arctic's enduring uncertainty, the narrative now shifts once again, this time away from the extremes of polar isolation and back toward the dense, gaslit corridors of the 19th century city, where mystery no longer emerges from the landscape, but from the threshold of a doorway. In Victorian England, as industrial expansion reshaped cities and electric light slowly replaced gas lamps, urban life was still deeply shadowed by narrow streets, heavy fog, and the constant contrast between progress and superstition. Within this environment, crowded, transitional, and often uneasy, there are scattered accounts preserved in letters, diaries, and newspaper fragments that describe encounters with figures who seem almost ordinary at first glance, until something about them disrupts that assumption entirely. The reports are inconsistent in detail, yet they share a recurring pattern. Late-night visitors appearing at doorways, requesting entry under vague or urgent pretenses. Some accounts describe strangers claiming to be lost, injured, or seeking shelter from bad weather. Others involve individuals who stood silently outside homes, motionless, observing without explanation. But what makes these accounts particularly unsettling in later retellings is a specific and repeated detail. Eyes described as unusually dark, sometimes said to lack visible iris distinction in low light, creating an impression of depth rather than clarity. In most cases, these encounters end the same way: refusal at the threshold, followed by the visitor's immediate departure. Yet what lingers in the records is not the interaction itself, but the emotional response it provoked. Witnesses described an instinctive unease, an impression that something about the visitor did not align with expected human behavior, even when no explicit threat was present. Mainstream historical interpretation approaches these accounts with caution. Many researchers suggest that such descriptions can be explained through a combination of environmental conditions and psychological perception. Gaslit streets, heavy shadows, and limited visibility could easily distort facial features at night. Fatigue, fear, or heightened suggestibility may have further influenced how strangers were remembered. In this view, the black-eyed aspect may not reflect a literal physical trait, but rather the effect of darkness, reflection, or misinterpretation under low-light conditions. There is also the possibility that these stories were shaped by the broader Victorian fascination with moral anxiety and the unknown. Literature of the period frequently explored themes of hidden identities, moral corruption, and unseen forces moving through society. It is not difficult to imagine how such cultural currents might influence the way ambiguous encounters were later recorded or retold. Yet some accounts resist easy dismissal. A small number of descriptions emphasize not just appearance, but behavior, specifically the insistence on being allowed inside. In these cases, witnesses reported an unusual persistence, as though entry into the home was the primary objective rather than conversation or assistance. The uniformity of this detail across separate narratives has led some folklorists to consider whether these stories represent a symbolic motif rather than literal events, a recurring narrative structure expressing deeper social fears about intrusion, vulnerability, and the sanctity of domestic space. More speculative interpretations have occasionally emerged in modern discussions, drawing connections between these Victorian accounts and contemporary urban legends involving similarly described figures. These comparisons, while not supported by historical continuity, reflect how certain patterns of storytelling persist across time. Strangers at thresholds, requests for entry, and the uneasy tension between hospitality and caution. Still, no definitive explanation fully accounts for why these specific details recur across multiple accounts, separated by time and location. Whether shaped by perception, cultural narrative, or rare and unexplained encounters, the pattern remains consistent enough to resist complete resolution. Today, these Victorian-era reports exist in a quiet space between folklore and historical anecdote, preserved not as confirmed phenomena, but as fragmented impressions of moments that left a lasting psychological mark on those who experienced them. And so the question lingers at the edge of the threshold itself. When multiple accounts describe encounters that feel unsettling not because of what was said, but because of what was sensed, how do we distinguish between the distortions of perception and the possibility that something unfamiliar briefly stood at the door? From the unsettling threshold encounters of Victorian London, where uncertainty seemed to linger just beyond the reach of gaslight, the narrative now shifts westward along the Thames, toward a quieter district that, at the turn of the 19th century, would become the setting for one of England's most unusual intersections of fear, rumor, and law. Hammersmith, in the early 1800s, was a riverside village on the outskirts of London. Narrow lanes stretched between fields and scattered houses, and the darkness of winter nights fell heavily over the Thames, broken only by the faint glow of lanterns and the distant movement of boats along the water. It was a place where urban expansion had not yet fully erased rural isolation, and where stories could travel quickly through tight-knit communities, gaining weight with each retelling. In the winter of 1803 to 1804, reports began to circulate of a strange figure seen wandering the streets and footpaths of Hammersmith. The figure was described consistently across multiple accounts, a tall, white-clothed apparition, moving silently through graveyards, alleyways, and open roads. Witnesses claimed it appeared suddenly, often at dusk or during the deepest hours of night, before vanishing without trace. The presence of the so-called Hammersmith ghost quickly became a subject of local fear. Residents avoided certain paths after dark. Guards were posted. Rumors spread that the figure might be the spirit of a man who had recently died under unclear circumstances, possibly by suicide, though no definitive connection was ever confirmed. In an era where supernatural interpretation remained culturally familiar, the idea of a restless presence moving through the village did not seem entirely outside the realm of possibility for many who lived there. As sightings continued, the situation escalated beyond rumor. One night, a local excise officer named Francis Smith reportedly encountered the figure and, believing it to be a threat, pursued it. In the confusion and fear of the moment, Smith fired his weapon, striking and killing a local resident, Thomas Millwood, who had been returning home wearing white clothing similar to that described in the ghost sightings. The tragic case quickly transformed what had been a spectral mystery into a legal and moral crisis. The aftermath of the incident led to one of the most unusual trials of the period. Smith was charged with murder, but ultimately convicted of manslaughter, reflecting the court's recognition of mistaken identity under extreme conditions of fear and uncertainty. The legal proceedings highlighted a central tension: whether the ghost had ever been more than a misinterpretation of ordinary circumstances shaped by collective anxiety. Mainstream historical analysis tends to view the Hammersmith ghost panic as a convergence of social psychology, rumor propagation, and environmental conditions. Poor lighting, limited visibility, and the absence of reliable identification methods at night could easily transform an ordinary figure into something ambiguous or threatening. Once the idea of a ghost took hold within the community, each subsequent sighting reinforced the expectation of its presence, creating a cycle in which perception and belief began to reinforce one another. Yet even within rational explanations, certain aspects of the case continued to invite reflection. Witnesses from different backgrounds reported remarkably similar descriptions of the figure before the fatal encounter occurred. The consistency of these accounts raises questions about how shared perception forms in isolated communities, and how quickly collective interpretation can stabilize around a single idea, even one as intangible as a ghost. There are also broader cultural interpretations to consider. In early 19th century England, belief in apparitions was not unusual, and stories of spirits returning to unresolved locations were deeply embedded in folklore traditions. The Hammersmith sightings may reflect not only misidentification, but also the persistence of narrative structures that shaped how unexplained phenomena were understood. In this sense, the ghost becomes less a singular entity and more a reflection of how fear, expectation, and environment interact in moments of uncertainty. Still, the central ambiguity remains. No physical evidence ever confirmed the existence of a supernatural presence, yet the emotional and social impact of the sightings was undeniably real. A single figure, misunderstood, misidentified, or imagined, was enough to alter behavior, provoke fear, and ultimately contribute to irreversible consequences. Today, the Hammersmith ghost panic stands as both a legal case and a cultural memory, preserved in historical records as a moment when perception itself became a matter of life and death. From the fog-shrouded streets of Hammersmith, where fear once took shape in the form of a wandering figure, the narrative now turns southward, beyond England's riverbanks and across the Mediterranean Sea, toward a coastal city where history itself has recorded something far more unsettling than a shadow in the night. Messina, situated on the northeastern tip of Sicily, has long stood as a meeting point between sea and land, between civilizations and storms. Its harbor opens into the narrow strait separating Sicily from mainland Italy, a stretch of water known for its shifting currents and sudden changes in weather. Over centuries, Messina has endured earthquakes, invasions, and maritime disasters, each leaving its mark on the city's layered memory. But among these recorded events, one account has remained especially difficult to interpret. In the early 16th century, chronicles from the region describe a phenomenon that would later be referred to as blood rain. According to historical accounts preserved in local and ecclesiastical records, the city and surrounding countryside were struck by rainfall that appeared unusually dark in color, sometimes described as red or crimson in tone. The event reportedly left stains on buildings, clothing, and exposed surfaces, prompting immediate concern among those who witnessed it. For the people of Messina, living within a worldview shaped by religious interpretation and natural observation, such an occurrence was not easily dismissed as ordinary weather. Some contemporaries recorded the event as an omen, a sign carrying moral or spiritual significance. Others attempted to document it more practically, noting the unusual appearance of the rain while seeking explanations within the limits of their scientific understanding at the time. Mainstream modern analysis offers several possible explanations for such reports. One widely accepted theory involves the presence of airborne dust or sand particles carried by strong winds from distant regions, particularly from the Sahara Desert. When mixed with rainfall, these particles can create a reddish or brownish tint, sometimes appearing dramatic when observed against light-colored surfaces. Another possibility involves microscopic organisms or algae that can tint water under certain conditions, though the historical descriptions of sudden, city-wide effects make this explanation more complex when applied retrospectively. There is also the consideration of atmospheric conditions unique to coastal regions like Messina. The convergence of sea air, mountain winds, and seasonal storms can produce unusual weather patterns, including rain carrying particulate matter from volcanic activity or distant environmental disturbances. Sicily's proximity to Mount Etna adds another layer of geological complexity, where volcanic ash could theoretically influence precipitation under specific circumstances. Yet despite these grounded explanations, the historical accounts of Messina's blood rain remain difficult to fully reconstruct with certainty. The language used in early descriptions is often symbolic as well as observational, blending physical detail with emotional and cultural interpretation. For witnesses of the time, the visual impact of red-tinted rain falling over streets and rooftops may have carried meanings that extended beyond meteorology alone. Some historians have suggested that the perception of blood in rainfall could have been amplified by psychological and contextual factors. In eras marked by uncertainty, disease, and social upheaval, unusual natural events were often interpreted through a moral or religious lens. The color red itself, strongly associated with blood in many cultural traditions, could transform an uncommon weather event into something far more symbolically charged in the collective memory of a community. Still, there remain aspects of the phenomenon that resist simple dismissal. Multiple accounts from different sources describe similar visual impressions, and the recurrence of such reports across different periods in Mediterranean history suggests that Messina was not entirely alone in experiencing this kind of atmospheric anomaly. Whether these accounts describe identical physical processes or a series of similar but distinct events remains an open question. Today, the blood rain of Messina is studied at the intersection of meteorology, history, and cultural interpretation. It stands as an example of how natural phenomena can be filtered through the human need to find meaning in what is seen, especially when the event itself defies immediate explanation. And so the question lingers over the strait, where sea and sky continue their constant exchange. When rain falls in a form that challenges expectation and memory alike, how much of what is recorded belongs to the atmosphere itself, and how much belongs to the eyes that were trying to understand it? From the storm-darkened skies over Messina, where even rain seemed to carry unanswered questions, the narrative now shifts northward into the industrial heart of Italy, where the air itself began to carry a different kind of mystery, one not falling from the heavens, but seemingly emerging from within a human life. Turin, at the turn of the 20th century, was a city defined by transformation. Factories rose alongside Baroque architecture, and the hum of early electrical infrastructure began to weave itself into daily life. Streetcars rattled through wide boulevards, and laboratories in universities and private institutions explored the unseen forces shaping the modern world. It was an era when electricity itself still felt partially mysterious, understood in principle, but not yet fully domesticated in imagination. It is within this atmosphere that accounts emerged of a young girl from Turin who came to be associated with unexplained electrical phenomena. Known in later retellings as the Electric Girl of Turin, her story appears in fragmented historical references connected to early parapsychological investigations in Italy. While documentation is limited and often secondary, the accounts describe a series of unusual occurrences centered around her presence. Objects were said to move or react in her proximity without direct physical contact. Light disturbances, faint electrical discharges, and inexplicable sensations of static charge were reportedly observed by those who visited or studied her case. In some descriptions, small metallic objects appeared to respond to her touch in ways that suggested unusual conductivity or charge accumulation. These reports, while inconsistent in detail, created a pattern that drew the attention of early researchers interested in the boundaries between physiology and physics. Mainstream scientific interpretation of such phenomena tends to approach these accounts with caution. In the early 1900s, the study of electricity was still developing, and many natural explanations were not yet fully understood in practical or experimental terms. Static electricity, environmental conditions, and sensitivity to atmospheric charge can all produce effects that might appear unusual without controlled observation. Additionally, psychological and observational bias, particularly in cases involving public interest, can influence how events are recorded and remembered. Some historians also suggest that the label "Electric Girl" may have been shaped more by interpretation than by consistent experimental verification. In an era fascinated by emerging sciences and unexplained human abilities, unusual behavior could easily be framed within the language of electricity, even when underlying causes were not clearly established. Yet the persistence of the story in various accounts has kept it alive in discussions of early anomalous investigations. Certain reports emphasize repeated observations across different settings, suggesting that at least some witnesses believed the effects to be consistent rather than isolated incidents. This has led to ongoing speculation about whether the phenomena, if accurately described, might have had a physiological basis not fully understood at the time. More speculative interpretations have occasionally been proposed in broader discussions of historical anomalies. These range from rare neurological or bioelectrical conditions to environmental interactions that temporarily amplified natural electrical effects in ways that appeared extraordinary to observers. Others frame the account within the context of early attempts to explore human potential beyond conventional scientific frameworks, where observation and interpretation were still deeply intertwined. There are also cultural considerations. In the early 20th century, the boundary between emerging science and popular fascination was often fluid. Figures associated with unusual abilities were sometimes elevated into symbolic representations of modernity's mysteries, embodying both the promise and uncertainty of scientific progress. Within this context, the Electric Girl of Turin becomes not only a subject of reported phenomena, but also a reflection of a society grappling with invisible forces now becoming part of everyday life. Still, despite attempts at explanation, the historical record remains incomplete. The lack of consistent experimental data, combined with the fragmented nature of surviving accounts, leaves significant gaps in understanding what was actually observed and under what conditions. Today, the story exists in a space between early scientific curiosity and modern reinterpretation, a reminder of how easily emerging knowledge can blend with perception, expectation, and narrative shaping. From the charged atmosphere of early industrial Turin, where unseen forces seemed to blur the line between science and mystery, the narrative now descends once more, this time not into cities or storms, but into the deepest imagined layers of the earth itself, where knowledge fades and speculation begins to take shape in the absence of certainty. Across the 20th century, particularly in the decades following the rise of modern science fiction publishing, a series of unconventional accounts and literary claims began to circulate around the idea of vast subterranean worlds hidden beneath the planet's surface. Among the most controversial of these narratives were those associated with what later became known as shaver-like hollow earth encounters, stories that emerged from a blend of personal testimony, imaginative literature, and disputed interpretations of unexplained phenomena. The surface world, as described in these accounts, was only one layer of a far larger and more complex structure. Beneath it, according to the narratives, lay immense caverns, interconnected tunnels, and hidden environments where unknown civilizations or entities might exist. These claims were not part of mainstream geology or accepted scientific frameworks, yet they persisted in cultural memory through magazines, letters, and speculative publications that blurred the boundary between storytelling and reported experience. The most famous catalyst for this line of thought was the publication of unusual narratives in mid-20th century science fiction circles, where certain authors claimed their stories were not purely fictional, but based on real experiences or hidden knowledge. These accounts described encounters with underground beings, ancient technologies, and vast hollow regions within the earth. While widely dismissed by the scientific community, the persistence of these ideas contributed to a lasting subculture of hollow earth theories that continued to evolve over time. Mainstream geology, supported by seismic studies, plate tectonics, and direct observation, firmly establishes that the earth is composed of layered structures, a crust, mantle, and core, each with well-documented physical properties. No empirical evidence has ever supported the existence of large habitable voids or civilizations within the planet. However, the endurance of hollow earth narratives does not stem from scientific validation, but from the human tendency to explore the unknown through imaginative extension of gaps in knowledge. Some interpretations suggest that these stories reflect psychological and cultural responses to unexplored environments. Deep caves, underwater systems, and remote geological formations can evoke a sense of entering another world entirely. In this sense, the idea of a hollow interior may symbolize the psychological impact of descending into spaces where light, orientation, and familiarity disappear. The mind, confronted with absolute darkness and isolation, can transform physical uncertainty into narrative structure. Other, more speculative perspectives have occasionally attempted to link hollow earth ideas to misunderstood natural phenomena. Unusual acoustic effects in large cave systems, rare geological formations, or unexplained navigational anomalies have sometimes been reinterpreted through the lens of subterranean mystery. Yet none of these observations require or support the existence of inhabited inner worlds. Still, what keeps the shaver-like narratives alive in cultural discussion is not empirical evidence, but the structure of the stories themselves. They describe hidden realms just beyond reach, civilizations concealed beneath familiar ground, and forgotten histories buried not in time, but in space. This narrative pattern echoes across folklore traditions worldwide, where underground worlds often symbolize the unknown foundations beneath visible reality. In modern discussions, these accounts are generally studied as part of the history of speculative literature and fringe belief systems. They reveal how scientific advancement and imaginative interpretation can develop in parallel, each responding to the same fundamental curiosity: what exists beyond the limits of what we can directly observe? And yet, even as science continues to map the Earth's interior with increasing precision, the appeal of the unknown beneath our feet has not entirely faded. The idea of hidden depths, whether literal or symbolic, continues to surface whenever certainty meets its boundary. So the question remains, echoing through both geological fact and cultural imagination. When we stand on solid ground and consider everything beneath it already known, are we truly looking at a complete map of reality, or only at the part we have learned how to see? From the imagined depths beneath the Earth's surface, where stories of hidden worlds blur the line between speculation and symbolism, the narrative now rises once more toward the surface of the known world, toward a place defined not by what lies beneath it, but by what suddenly disappeared from within it. Far out in the North Atlantic, between the rugged coastlines of Scotland and the open, shifting expanse of sea, lie the Flannan Isles, a small, isolated chain of rocky outcrops battered by wind, salt, and relentless weather. Among them stands Eilean Moor, home to a lighthouse built in the late 19th century to guide ships through one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the region. It is a place where isolation is not occasional, but constant, where human presence feels temporary against the scale of ocean and storm. In December 1900, that isolation became absolute. Records from the lighthouse service describe a routine that should have been familiar and carefully maintained. 3 lighthouse keepers were stationed at Eilean Moor, responsible for keeping the light burning through long winter nights, ensuring the safety of passing vessels. Supplies were delivered periodically, and communication with the mainland was limited but structured. Then, at some point during that winter, contact was lost. When a relief vessel arrived to replace the keepers, something immediately felt wrong. The lighthouse was intact, the door secured, and the light no longer operating. Inside, everything appeared strangely preserved. Beds were unmade. A meal had reportedly been left unfinished. A chair was found overturned. Yet the 3 men assigned to the station, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, were nowhere to be found. No signs of struggle were immediately visible. No clear evidence of departure by boat or land. The surrounding cliffs and shoreline offered no obvious trace of movement. In a place where the sea dominates every horizon, it was as if the men had simply stepped out of the structure and dissolved into the landscape beyond it. Mainstream explanations for the disappearance tend to focus on environmental conditions. The Flannan Isles are known for extreme weather, sudden storms, and powerful waves capable of sweeping across cliffs without warning. One widely accepted theory suggests that one or more of the keepers may have left the lighthouse during severe conditions to secure equipment or investigate damage, only to be overwhelmed by the sea. In this interpretation, the remaining keepers may have followed, resulting in a sequence of tragic misjudgments under extreme pressure. Official reports from the time attempted to reconstruct the timeline through log entries and environmental observations, but inconsistencies remain. Weather records indicate severe storms in the days leading up to the discovery, yet the lighthouse interior suggested a sudden interruption rather than a prolonged evacuation. The absence of bodies or confirmed wreckage has continued to leave space for uncertainty within the historical record. Over time, alternative interpretations have emerged, shaped as much by isolation psychology as by physical evidence. The Flannan Isles, with their constant wind, shifting light, and total separation from mainland life, present conditions that can profoundly affect human perception and decision-making. Some researchers have suggested that stress, disorientation, or miscommunication in extreme weather could have contributed to a cascading sequence of actions that ultimately led the men away from safety. More speculative accounts, often rooted in folklore rather than documentation, have imagined the disappearance as something less conventional, attributing it to forces beyond ordinary explanation, or interpreting the event through symbolic lenses of the sea as an active, consuming presence. While these interpretations lack empirical support, they reflect the enduring human tendency to frame unresolved absences in narrative terms that extend beyond the purely physical. What remains consistent across all accounts is not a confirmed sequence of events, but an absence that resists closure. The lighthouse was functioning, then it was not. The men were present, then they were gone. Between those two states lies a gap that history has not been able to fully reconstruct. Today, Eilean Moor still stands against the Atlantic, its lighthouse continuing to operate automatically, long after human keepers have been replaced by technology. Yet the story of the vanished shepherds of light persists as one of the sea's quieter mysteries, not marked by spectacle, but by silence. And so the question remains, carried on wind and tide across the Flannan Isles. When everything inside a place is left behind except the people who tended it, do we interpret that absence as an ending, or as a moment in a story we have not yet learned how to read? From the silent disappearance on the storm-battered Flannan Isles, where lighthouse keepers vanished into an unanswered horizon, the narrative now returns once more to land, where the mystery no longer unfolds in isolation, but along a quiet stretch of railway line that cuts through the darkness of a southern American night. In southeastern North Carolina, near the small rural community of Maco, a modest railroad track once ran through swampy terrain, pine forests, and low-lying marshland. In the late 19th century, this area was far removed from major urban centers, its nights shaped by dense humidity, limited visibility, and the rhythmic sound of trains passing through on long-distance routes. It is here, according to regional accounts, that a strange and persistent phenomenon came to be known as the Maco Light. The earliest stories place the event in the years following a tragic railway accident involving a brakeman named Joe Baldwin. Historical records confirm that Baldwin was killed while working on the tracks near Maco, reportedly struck during a nighttime operation. Shortly after this incident, local residents and railway workers began to report an unusual light appearing along the tracks in the same general area where the accident had occurred. Witnesses described the light as small, glowing, and seemingly suspended just above the railway line. It would appear unexpectedly in the distance, often at night, moving slowly along the track before vanishing without a clear source. Some accounts suggest it would approach trains head-on, causing engineers and passengers to watch in confusion or unease, as it seemed to hover or drift through the darkness without sound. In many versions of the story, the light was attributed to Baldwin himself, whose presence was said to persist in some unexplained form after his death. This interpretation, while rooted in local folklore, reflects a broader cultural tendency to connect unexplained phenomena with human tragedy, particularly in environments where sudden loss leaves strong emotional impressions on a community. Mainstream explanations for the Maco light tend to focus on natural and technological causes. One widely discussed possibility involves atmospheric conditions common in swampy regions, where gases such as methane can ignite under specific circumstances, producing faint, flickering lights known as ignis fatuus or will-o'-the-wisp phenomena. These natural emissions, combined with humidity and temperature variations, can create optical effects that appear to move or hover when viewed from a distance. Another explanation considers the role of railway optics and human perception. The reflective properties of tracks, combined with distant headlamps, fog, and the curvature of rails at night, can produce visual illusions that seem to behave in unusual ways. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, train engineers navigating poorly lit rural routes often relied on limited visual cues, which could easily be distorted under the right conditions. Yet despite these grounded interpretations, the Maco light persisted in regional memory long after the railway itself was altered and modernized. Reports continued intermittently into the 20th century, even as infrastructure improved and environmental conditions changed. This persistence has led some researchers to consider whether the phenomenon is not tied to a single cause, but rather to a combination of environmental factors and narrative reinforcement over time. There are also more speculative interpretations that have emerged in folklore studies and local storytelling traditions. Some suggest that the repeated association of the light with a specific individual may reflect a psychological need to give form and identity to an otherwise ambiguous natural occurrence. In this view, the ghost light becomes less a literal manifestation and more a narrative anchor, linking memory, place, and tragedy into a single, enduring image. Other interpretations remain intentionally open-ended. Could the Maco light represent a rare convergence of environmental conditions that only occurs under specific, now altered circumstances? Or might it have been an early example of a phenomenon misunderstood at the time due to the limitations of available scientific knowledge and observational tools? What makes the Maco light particularly enduring is not only the number of reported sightings, but the consistency of its description across decades. A light that appears along the tracks, moves with apparent intention, and vanishes without physical trace. Whether this consistency points to a repeatable natural effect or a shared pattern of perception remains an open question. Today, the original railway line near Maco has been largely changed by time and infrastructure, but the story of the light continues to be retold in local history, tourism accounts, and broader collections of unexplained phenomena. It survives not as a confirmed scientific mystery, but as a memory embedded in the landscape itself. And so the question remains, stretching along those quiet rails into the darkness. When a light appears again and again in the same place across generations, is it revealing something hidden within the environment, or simply reflecting the way human memory continues to illuminate what time has never fully explained? From the dim glow of the Maco railway light, where legend and atmosphere blurred into a single persistent image along the tracks, the narrative now drifts outward once more, this time away from land entirely, and into the frozen silence of the Arctic seas, where even communication itself becomes fragile, distorted, and uncertain. In the early 20th century, the Arctic Ocean was still a space of incomplete knowledge, where shipping routes were dictated by ice conditions and seasonal risk, rather than reliable navigation systems. Among the vessels operating in these waters was the SS Baychimo, a cargo steamer used primarily for trade along remote northern coastal settlements. It was a working ship of its time, functional, unremarkable in design, yet destined to become one of the most enduring maritime enigmas of the Arctic. Historical records confirm that in 1931, the Baychimo became trapped in pack ice near the coast of Alaska. The crew, facing deteriorating conditions, eventually abandoned the vessel, expecting it to be lost permanently to the shifting ice fields. But what followed was not the end of the story. The ship, instead of sinking or being destroyed, remained intact, frozen into the Arctic landscape, drifting slowly with the ice itself. In the years that followed, the Baychimo was reportedly sighted multiple times by different expeditions and crews. At first, these sightings were consistent with expectations. A derelict vessel, partially buried in ice, occasionally visible when conditions allowed. But over time, reports began to describe something more unusual. The ship appeared in different locations across vast distances, sometimes upright, sometimes tilted, but still seemingly intact and recognizable. What transformed the Baychimo from a stranded vessel into a maritime mystery were the accounts of intermittent, unexplained signals. Some reports from Arctic explorers and pilots describe faint radio transmissions or ambiguous distress-like signals detected in regions where the ship was believed to be drifting. These signals were never consistently recorded, nor were they definitively traced back to a confirmed source, but they contributed to a growing sense that the vessel remained, in some form, active long after its abandonment. Mainstream explanations for these phenomena tend to emphasize the limitations of Arctic communication and observation during the early to mid-20th century. Radio interference, atmospheric distortion, and the reflective properties of ice and auroral activity can all produce irregular signals or false readings. In regions near the magnetic poles, navigation and transmission systems were especially prone to disruption, creating conditions where misinterpretation was not only possible, but common. It is also widely accepted that the Baychimo itself, drifting unpredictably with ice flows, could have been encountered multiple times over the years before finally disappearing from confirmed sight entirely. In such a dynamic environment, a single abandoned ship could reappear across different locations over time, giving the impression of movement or persistence beyond its actual condition. Yet despite these explanations, the story of the Baychimo continues to attract attention because of its unusual longevity as a maritime mystery. Unlike many lost vessels, which are either recovered or conclusively destroyed, the Baychimo entered a state of prolonged uncertainty. Sightings continued intermittently for decades, with the last widely reported encounter occurring in the 1960s, when the ship was allegedly observed still adrift in Arctic ice. This extended timeline has led some researchers to explore more speculative interpretations, not as assertions of fact, but as reflections on the limits of observation in extreme environments. Could environmental conditions alone account for the repeated but inconsistent signals and sightings? Or do these reports highlight the difficulty of tracking objects in regions where ice, weather, and magnetic interference continuously reshape perception and communication? There is also the broader question of how abandoned technology behaves in environments that resist decay in expected ways. In the Arctic, freezing temperatures can preserve structures far longer than in temperate climates, while ice movement can transport objects across vast distances without human intervention. Within this context, the Baychimo becomes not just a lost ship, but a drifting artifact, its presence intermittently confirmed yet never fully resolved. Today, the SS Baychimo is officially listed as lost to history, its final fate unrecorded with certainty. No verified remains have been conclusively identified, and its exact resting place remains unknown. And so the question lingers across the frozen silence of the Arctic seas. When a vessel continues to appear across time and distance, carrying faint echoes of communication and presence, are we witnessing the last movements of a drifting relic, or the limits of how far human observation can truly follow something once it slips beyond reach? From the drifting silence of the Arctic seas, where even a ship can become a wandering echo across decades of ice, the narrative now returns to land once more, this time not to machines or mysteries of movement, but to a quieter and far more haunting kind of uncertainty, preserved not in water or wind, but in memory itself. In the outskirts of London lies a small wooded area known as Prittlewell, or, in broader historical association, the ancient rural landscapes tied to the Essex countryside. It is a place that, in earlier centuries, would have been far more isolated than it appears today, dense with trees, uneven ground, and pockets of wilderness that could easily conceal what lay within them. It is here, in this environment of partial visibility and rural distance, that one of England's most enduring identity mysteries emerged. The story commonly referred to as the Babes in the Wood. The historical origins of the case trace back to accounts from the late 17th century, centered on two young children whose remains were discovered in a wooded area after they had reportedly been abandoned. Contemporary records from the period are fragmented, shaped by the limitations of early record-keeping and the passage of time. What is known is that the children's identities were never conclusively established, and their story quickly entered public consciousness as both a tragedy and a moral narrative, later retold through poems, illustrations, and oral tradition. In the absence of definitive identification, the children became symbolic figures, representing innocence, vulnerability, and the dangers of neglect in a world where social protections were still developing. But beneath the emotional and cultural interpretations, a more complex question has persisted through historical study. Who exactly were they? Mainstream historical analysis suggests that the lack of identification may be attributed to the limitations of the era. In a time before standardized records, modern forensic science, or consistent birth registration, it was not uncommon for individuals, especially children from poorer or transient families, to remain undocumented. Environmental conditions may also have contributed to the difficulty of preserving evidence that could have established identity with certainty. Some historians further propose that the story of the babes in the wood may have evolved over time, combining multiple accounts or similar incidents into a single narrative framework. In this interpretation, the identity mystery is not necessarily a single unresolved case, but a convergence of several fragmented histories that became unified through storytelling and cultural transmission. Yet even within this framework, certain elements remain difficult to fully reconcile. Accounts from the time describe burial arrangements and later commemorations that suggest a level of community recognition that extended beyond anonymous remains. Local traditions preserved specific details, yet those details do not always align with official records, creating a tension between documented history and collective memory. This gap has led some researchers to consider alternative perspectives, not as definitive explanations, but as reflections on the limits of historical reconstruction. Could the children have been travelers, or individuals passing through regions where record-keeping was minimal? Could their identities have been known locally but lost during later transitions in administration and record preservation? There are also broader interpretive approaches that view the story not solely as a literal historical case, but as a narrative shaped by social conditions of the time. In this reading, The Babes in the Wood becomes a cultural expression of fear surrounding abandonment, poverty, and the fragility of childhood in early modern society. The lack of identity, rather than being a simple absence of information, becomes part of the story's enduring emotional weight. Still, despite centuries of retelling, no conclusive identification has emerged that fully resolves the question of who the children were. The case remains suspended between historical fact, incomplete record, and cultural memory, each layer adding detail, but none closing the gap entirely. Today, the story continues to be revisited by historians, folklorists, and those interested in unresolved identity cases from the past. It stands as a reminder of how easily individual lives can become indistinct when documentation is incomplete and time continues forward without pause. And so the question remains, resting quietly beneath the trees where the story first began. When identity is lost to history and memory becomes the only remaining record, are we looking at an unsolved case, or at the limits of how far the past can ever truly be recovered? From the quiet woods where the identity of lost children faded into folklore and incomplete record, the narrative now shifts from rural England to the deeper corridors of European memory, where history itself becomes layered, rewritten, and periodically reinterpreted by later generations seeking clarity in stories that were never fully resolved. Among the most enduring enigmas of early modern Europe is the figure known as the Man in the Iron Mask, a prisoner whose identity was concealed behind enforced anonymity during the reign of Louis XIV of France. While the original historical case belongs to the 17th and early 18th centuries, it was during the Victorian era that renewed scholarly and popular interest began to re-examine the mystery with new methods of historical inquiry, archival research, and expanding fascination with concealed identities. The prisoner himself is known not through personal testimony, but through fragments of administrative records, prison logs, and accounts from guards and officials who encountered him under strict conditions of secrecy. He was transferred between multiple prisons, including the Bastille, and always under unusual instructions. His face was to remain hidden, his name unspoken, and his identity erased from official discourse. The most famous image associated with him, the Iron Mask, may itself be symbolic or exaggerated, as some accounts describe a velvet mask rather than metal, though the notion of an unbreakable concealment became central to the legend. By the Victorian period, historians and amateur researchers began revisiting the case with renewed interest. Archival studies in France and Britain attempted to reconcile conflicting accounts, comparing prison records, correspondence, and diplomatic documents. The question that drove this reinvestigation was not only who the prisoner was, but why such extraordinary secrecy was deemed necessary for so long. Mainstream historical interpretations generally reject the idea of a single dramatic identity, such as a royal twin or hidden heir, as later romanticized theories often suggest. Instead, many scholars propose that the prisoner was likely a politically sensitive figure, possibly a disgraced nobleman, a confidential diplomatic agent, or someone whose knowledge posed a risk to state stability. In this view, the enforced anonymity was less about personal mythology and more about political containment within an absolutist system where information itself was power. Yet Victorian reinvestigations were not limited to administrative reasoning alone. The period's fascination with hidden histories, secret lineages, and concealed truths often shaped how researchers approached the case. Some Victorian writers entertained more elaborate possibilities, including theories involving royal succession disputes, secret imprisonment of individuals closely connected to the royal family, or politically motivated erasure of identity to protect state legitimacy. These ideas, while speculative, reflected the era's broader intellectual climate, where historical mystery and narrative reconstruction often intertwined. There were also attempts to interpret the prisoner's prolonged isolation through psychological and human terms. What does it mean for a person to exist for decades without name, face, or public identity? Even without confirming the more dramatic theories, Victorian observers were struck by the moral and philosophical implications of enforced anonymity, where a human life continues, but its public recognition does not. Modern historians, applying more rigorous source criticism, tend to emphasize the limitations of the surviving evidence. Many of the most dramatic elements associated with the Iron Mask narrative appear to have been shaped by later literary embellishment, particularly in 18th and 19th century retellings. Each retelling added layers of symbolism, transforming a historical prisoner into a figure representing secrecy itself. And yet, despite careful archival work, no single identification has achieved universal acceptance. Multiple candidates have been proposed across centuries of scholarship, each supported by partial evidence, none confirmed beyond doubt. The result is a historical space defined not by absence of information, but by competing interpretations of incomplete records. Today, the man in the Iron Mask remains less a solved identity than a shifting intersection between documented history and narrative reinvention. Victorian reinvestigations contributed significantly to shaping how the story is understood, not by resolving it, but by expanding the range of possible meanings attached to it. And so the question persists, echoing through prison corridors long emptied of their original occupants. When a life is deliberately obscured by authority and time continues to pass, do we ever recover the truth of who that person was, or only the evolving reflections of what later generations believe they might have been? From the sealed anonymity of the man in the Iron Mask, where identity itself became something that could be concealed, rewritten, or erased by authority, the narrative now moves far beyond the courts and prisons of Europe, toward a landscape where silence is not imposed by decree, but by distance, cold, and abandonment. High above the Arctic Circle, on the island of Spitsbergen in the Svalbard archipelago, lies Pyramiden, a settlement once built with ambition, industry, and permanence in mind. Surrounded by glaciers and frozen mountain ridges, it sits in one of the most remote inhabited regions of the Northern Hemisphere. Even today, the journey to reach it feels like crossing into a threshold where time itself slows and human presence becomes uncertain. Founded in the early 20th century and developed extensively during the Soviet era, Pyramiden was designed as a model mining town. It contained housing blocks, cultural centers, a swimming pool, a cinema, schools, and industrial infrastructure. An entire society constructed in a place where survival alone is already a challenge. For decades, it functioned as a self-contained world, sustained by coal extraction and the belief that human settlement could persist even in the farthest edges of the Arctic. At its peak, Pyramiden was not merely a workplace, but a statement of endurance against environment. Yet today, it stands largely abandoned, its buildings preserved by permafrost, its interiors frozen in the moment of departure. Books remain on shelves, chairs rest where they were last placed, and communal spaces still carry the geometry of daily life that abruptly ceased. It is this abruptness that gives rise to the idea of precursors, subtle signs, early indicators, or faint anomalies reported in the years leading up to the town's eventual abandonment in 1998. Some accounts describe a gradual reduction in activity that was not immediately visible in physical form. Shifts in population morale, logistical strain, and the increasing difficulty of sustaining life in an environment where isolation was not temporary, but structural. Mainstream historical interpretation explains Pyramiden's decline through well-documented economic and geopolitical changes. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to the re-evaluation of remote industrial settlements, many of which became financially unsustainable. Transportation costs, declining output, and shifting political priorities contributed to the decision to gradually withdraw the population. In this view, the abandonment was not sudden or mysterious, but the result of long-term systemic transition. Yet what draws continued fascination is not only the known end, but the atmosphere of the place itself. The sense that departure did not erase presence, but simply paused it. Visitors to Pyramiden often describe an unusual feeling of suspended time, where buildings remain intact enough to suggest continuity, yet empty enough to suggest interruption. This duality has led some observers to speak of precursor signs, not as literal phenomena, but as interpretive impressions formed in hindsight. In more speculative reflections, Pyramiden is sometimes discussed as an example of how human systems behave under extreme environmental and political pressure. What begins as a thriving settlement can, under shifting conditions, transition into silence without dramatic rupture. The precursor in this sense is not a single event, but a gradual convergence of small changes, economic adjustments, population movement, infrastructure strain, that only appear significant when viewed after the fact. There are also environmental considerations that deepen the sense of ambiguity. The Arctic does not erase human structures in the way temperate climates do. Instead, it preserves them, locking objects in place and slowing decay. This preservation creates an unusual effect. Abandonment does not look like disappearance, but like interruption. Life appears paused rather than ended, as if it might resume at any moment. Some cultural interpretations extend this feeling further, suggesting that places like Pyramiden exist in a kind of temporal liminality, where human intention remains visible even after human presence has withdrawn. While not grounded in scientific claim, this perspective reflects how strongly environment can shape emotional and psychological responses to space. Modern studies of Arctic settlements emphasize that Pyramiden is not unique in its trajectory. Across the circumpolar north, multiple towns and industrial sites have experienced similar cycles of rapid development, followed by strategic or economic withdrawal. What distinguishes Pyramiden is the degree of preservation, which allows observers to encounter the remnants of daily life with unusual clarity. Walking through its corridors today, one does not encounter ruins in the traditional sense. Instead, there is structure without function, arrangement without motion. The absence is not destructive. It is quiet, orderly, and complete. And so the question emerges not from catastrophe, but from continuity itself. When a place is fully built, fully lived in, and then left intact without visible collapse, do we interpret its silence as an ending, or as a form of preservation we have not yet fully learned how to read? From the frozen stillness of Pyramiden, where entire lives appear paused in mid-motion beneath Arctic silence, the narrative now shifts far from the polar north, crossing oceans and climate zones into the dense, humid islands of Southeast Asia, where forests grow quickly, shadows deepen early, and oral tradition often carries as much weight as written record. On the island of Luzon in the Philippines, surrounded by mountainous terrain and thick tropical vegetation, there are scattered accounts tied to a group or phenomenon referred to in later retellings as the Berbalang. Unlike the structured records of European archives or Arctic settlements, these accounts exist primarily in ethnographic notes, colonial-era observations, and second-hand narratives recorded by outsiders attempting to document local belief systems during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Berbalang, as described in these reports, are associated with mortuary practices and beliefs surrounding death, the soul, and the boundary between the living and the deceased. Some accounts describe them not as a single group with a fixed identity, but as part of a broader set of ritual interpretations connected to death rites and spiritual mediation. In certain retellings, however, they take on a more specific and unusual form, becoming figures linked to nocturnal activity, grave visitation, and a controversial set of alleged practices that sit between folklore and reported observation. One of the most frequently cited early references comes from accounts recorded by Western visitors who documented local stories involving unusual post-mortem rituals. These narratives describe processes in which the boundary between life and death was perceived not as immediate and absolute, but as gradual and culturally mediated. Within this interpretive space, stories emerged of individuals or entities capable of interacting with the dead in ways that defied conventional explanation. Mainstream anthropology approaches these accounts with caution. Scholars emphasize that many of the most dramatic descriptions were recorded through colonial lenses, often filtered through misunderstanding, translation gaps, or a tendency to interpret unfamiliar cultural practices as supernatural phenomena. Rituals surrounding death in many Austronesian cultures are complex, deeply symbolic, and vary significantly between regions. What may appear extraordinary in one interpretive framework can be entirely contextual within another. In this light, the Berbalang are often understood not as literal beings, but as part of a broader mythological system that encodes beliefs about mortality, respect for the dead, and the maintenance of social and spiritual balance. Funeral practices in many traditional societies involve layered stages, symbolic acts, and extended periods of transition, during which the deceased are not considered fully separated from the world of the living. This conceptual framework can easily be misinterpreted when observed without cultural context. Yet, within the historical record, certain descriptions stand out for their specificity. Some accounts refer to nocturnal disturbances near burial sites or unusual perceptions experienced by individuals participating in ritual settings. Others describe stories of entities that appear during periods of mourning or transition, often framed in highly symbolic language that resists direct translation into modern scientific terminology. These elements have led some folklorists to explore the Berbalang narratives as part of a wider pattern of death adjacency folklore, stories that emerge in many cultures where the moment of death is surrounded by uncertainty, ritual caution, and symbolic interpretation. In such frameworks, figures associated with death are not necessarily physical beings, but narrative embodiments of transition itself. More speculative interpretations occasionally surface in fringe discussions, often disconnected from academic anthropology. These interpretations tend to isolate fragments of early accounts and reframe them as literal descriptions of hidden practices or unknown biological phenomena. However, such readings are not supported by reliable ethnographic methodology and are generally considered outside the bounds of historical evidence. What remains significant, however, is not the literal interpretation of the Berbalang accounts, but the persistence of their narrative form. Across different versions of the story, certain themes remain consistent: the liminal space between life and death, the role of ritual in managing uncertainty, and the human need to structure what cannot be directly observed. In many ways, these accounts reflect more about the observers than the observed. They reveal how unfamiliar cultural practices can be transformed into mystery when separated from their context, and how the language of the supernatural often emerges when explanation is incomplete or inaccessible. Even today, discussions of the Berbalang continue to appear in compilations of unexplained or mysterious phenomena, often detached from their original anthropological setting. Yet within academic study, they remain firmly situated within the broader framework of Southeast Asian ritual tradition and folklore interpretation. And so the question lingers, not at the edge of a single ritual or report, but across the boundary between understanding and misinterpretation. When a culture's relationship with death is described through unfamiliar eyes, are we witnessing something unknown, or simply the limits of how far observation can travel without context? From the humid forests and ritual landscapes of Luzon, where death is understood through layers of symbolism and cultural passage rather than silence alone, the narrative now returns once again to an urban setting, this time to a city shaped not by isolation or mythic distance, but by industry, migration, and the dense complexity of early 20th century modern life. Cleveland, Ohio, in the 1930s, was a city marked by contrasts. Factories rose beside rail yards, and working-class neighborhoods pressed against expanding industrial corridors. Beneath the infrastructure of progress lay a network of ravines, riverbanks, and neglected industrial fringes where the city's growth had not fully reached. One of these areas was Kingsbury Run, a low-lying, partially developed stretch of land that cut through Cleveland like an unfinished boundary, neither fully urban nor fully wild. It is here, in this marginal landscape, that a series of discoveries would begin to unsettle the city's sense of order. Between 1935 and 1938, authorities recovered multiple unidentified human remains in and around Kingsbury Run. The condition of the victims was striking enough to generate immediate concern and media attention. The cases shared similarities that suggested a pattern rather than isolated incidents, and it was this pattern that led investigators, and later the public, to associate the crimes with an unidentified figure often referred to as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Historical records confirm the involvement of law enforcement officials, including Cleveland Police Chief Elliot Ness, who led extensive efforts to identify and apprehend the perpetrator. Despite increased surveillance, raids on nearby encampments, and coordinated investigations, the identity of the individual responsible was never conclusively established. Yet beyond the documented facts of the investigation, later historical and forensic discussions began to consider what might be described as precursors, subtle, earlier indicators that something unusual was unfolding in the Kingsbury Run area before the crimes became widely recognized. These precursors are not formal evidence in a legal sense, but rather patterns identified in retrospect. Increased reports of missing persons in transient communities, fragmented sightings of unfamiliar individuals moving through rail corridors, and anecdotal accounts from workers and residents who described unusual nighttime activity in the ravine system all contribute to a broader contextual background. None of these reports individually confirm a single cause, but together they form a landscape of uncertainty that preceded the confirmed cases. Mainstream criminological interpretation frames the Kingsbury Run case as a product of socioeconomic instability, urban neglect, and the transient populations that moved through Cleveland during the Great Depression. Kingsbury Run itself, with its dense underbrush, abandoned structures, and limited visibility, created an environment where crimes could occur with reduced likelihood of immediate detection. In this view, the pattern is not evidence of something beyond human agency, but rather the predictable outcome of environmental and social conditions converging in a neglected urban corridor. Forensic analysis of the period was also limited by the technological constraints of the 1930s. Methods for identifying victims, tracing evidence, and establishing timelines were still developing. This left significant gaps in the investigative record, gaps that later interpretations sometimes attempt to fill with speculation or retrospective pattern recognition. However, what continues to draw attention to the Kingsbury Run case is not only the confirmed investigations, but the lingering sense of partial visibility. The area itself, once a patchwork of industrial use and abandonment, functioned as a kind of urban blind spot, close enough to the city to be accessible, yet irregular enough in terrain and usage to resist consistent oversight. In this environment, even ordinary movements could become ambiguous. A figure crossing a rail line at night, a campfire in a recessed ravine, or a disturbance near the riverbanks might be interpreted differently depending on distance, lighting, and context. Over time, these fragmented observations became part of a larger narrative structure, one that suggested continuity even when evidence remained incomplete. Some later interpretations, particularly in popular accounts and true crime retellings, have attempted to frame the Precursors as early manifestations of a single hidden individual operating before detection. These interpretations often rely on retrospective alignment of unrelated incidents, a process that can create patterns where none were originally established. While compelling in narrative form, such approaches are not supported by conclusive forensic linkage. More cautious historical perspectives emphasize that the idea of precursors may reflect the human tendency to impose structure on chaotic or incomplete information. When faced with unresolved cases, earlier unrelated events can appear, in hindsight, to form a coherent lead-up. This does not necessarily indicate causation, but rather the psychological drive to create continuity in the face of uncertainty. Still, even within rigorous analysis, the Kingsbury Run landscape remains significant. It represents a moment in urban history where infrastructure, poverty, migration, and environmental neglect intersected in ways that challenged the capacity of law enforcement and forensic science of the time. The lack of resolution in the case is not only about identity, but about the limits of visibility within a rapidly changing city. Today, Kingsbury Run has been altered by development and urban change, yet its historical reputation persists. It exists in memory not only as a location of crime, but as a space where boundaries, between seen and unseen, known and unknown, were unusually difficult to maintain. And so the question remains, lingering beneath the reconstructed streets and reshaped landscapes. When a pattern is recognized only after the fact, are we uncovering the early traces of a hidden sequence, or simply projecting order onto fragments that were never connected in the first place?